Sinan, thanks so much. And I'm a fanboy, I have to say, reciprocate here with you. I've been following Sinan's research for more than a decade and really groundbreaking stuff, including on propagation of false information in social media. That was something really terrific. I'm delighted to be here. I'm grateful that you asked. And I'm just going to share my screen before Sinan and I have a bit of a talk about this. Share with you something that we call the sense-making genome. Now, you have a genome, of course, but you also come pre-wired to make decisions. You have a series of filters that can either sharpen or distort your beliefs, your preferences, your decisions. And I've been working for many years on sort of evolving peer-reviewed science on behavioral science tests to create a kind of compendium of tests where I can now test individuals at large scale to better decode them. Now, when you use this for a purpose for good, it could possibly lead to rapprochement or resonance. But if you use it for ill will, it could be very malicious manipulation. So a huge caveat with everything you're about to see, because I don't think any of it is regulated yet and probably should be. So these are some new lenses to reveal human behavior that in marketing at least and communications have not been used and are starting to become adopted. We like to call it the hidden who because it is not the who you see demographically, again, of traditional research. It is this internal hardwiring. And I'm going to take you through three kinds of lenses here: personality traits, cognitive and affective styles, and worldviews and your tribal identity. As Sinan kindly said, this has scooped up about 6 or 7 global awards, so we feel like we're on the right track. The first one, personality traits, and don't mistake this with Myers-Briggs or DISC or emergenetics. It's very different. These are the accepted by the scientific community. It's called either 5-factor or Big 5, OCEAN, and that's the acronym OCEAN, sometimes called NEO, or even if they add a 6th trait called Hexaco. But the Big 5 and 5-factor are really the building blocks of human personality. You see those 5 factors, and they each have many subfacets. And I'm going to very quickly allow you to test yourself and think in mind about your colleagues, about maybe your family, your partner, your spouse, and see if you begin to see how different on the inside we really are and how important this is when you think about social media of, again, engagement, resonance, or malicious intent. So the first one is openness. It means openness to experience, not openness as in transparency. And all of these are on a spectrum. You could be anywhere from low to high. And you know, while these studies keep debating and digging into how mutable, how changeable our personality is, most of the studies to date have shown that your personality is pretty firmly baked in by about the time your ventromedial prefrontal cortex gets mature and probably around 26 or so years of age. And so also these traits in identical twin studies have been shown to be between 40 and 60% inherited. So you kind of come out half-baked. So openness to experience on the low end, you're more like K-Chuck 3 here, King Charles, where you're very much steeped in tradition and routine, not big on expressing your emotions in public. Meanwhile, on the other side, the other extreme, Sir Richard, big on adventure and fantasy and very much about expressing his emotion. The second one, the C in ocean, is conscientiousness. And let's take Harry Potter characters for this one. On the low end, you might be more like Ron Weasley. You kind of wing it. You're not so deadline or rules oriented. But on the high end, you're much more like Hermione Granger, where you really crave those rules to stick by. On introversion and extroversion, extroversion is the high factor, and the low version of that is introversion. I think you all know about that already. Agreeableness, When you're low, you're much more skeptical, sometimes come off as a bit irascible. You don't trust people very easily. Doesn't mean you're a bad person, but you're wired differently in terms you're not gushy and warm at first meeting. Meanwhile, on the high end, you're much more of that freely trusting and affable sort of personality. Now, neuroticism doesn't mean you're clinically neurotic. It means your worry threshold. And in fact, this becomes such a stigma that a lot of tests, they've reworded neuroticism to emotional stability. But in the OCEAN acronym, that doesn't work so well. So N for neuroticism. On the low end, you're more Yoda-like, and on the high end, you get wigged out pretty easily, more like a C3PO. Now, why do we go through these and look at personality traits of individuals at large scale? Because if you know how somebody comes pre-wired to a situation, to a context, to a decision, to a preference, it can inform you and be much more predictive. And I had the great fortune of co-authoring this with Professor Sandra Matz at Columbia University. It's really important to read her current work as well. She works deeply into personality trait science, but has shown that it has a predictive ability. So that's why it's good to know this. Now, the second lens is called cognitive styles. These are thinking and decision-making styles, but there are also some affect in there as well, emotion as well. And a quick quiz, just so you can begin to place yourself. Now, be honest with yourself. Which is closer to how you usually feel, A or B? A, it's more important to get it right. Take all the time you need to make a safe decision, and that's better than risking making big mistakes. Or B, I really go for it, even if that means risking making big mistakes, and that's how you achieve big goals. So again, this is a trait, but it's also a state. You can be nudged temporarily into this regulatory focus, which I'm about to show you, but you have an underlying chronic regulatory focus, which you kind of revert back to. Now, if you said B, it is said that you have a promotion focus. A promotion focus means you really are all about leveling up the next, and really going for it. And if you said A, you are wired with more of a chronic prevention focus, which means you're much more motivated by let's not get it wrong and let's avoid harm. And so if you see that A is motivated by achieving new goals, but really kind of pissed off about missing big opportunities, whereas prevention is very different, again, wired to avoid harm, and means you'll tend to stick with the status quo facing uncertainty, because uncertainty exposes you to possible failure and risks. And the reason this is important with humans to know if they're more prevention or promotion is, again, a more empathetic approach to meeting them on their terms. Next quiz. Are you more like this A or this B? A, in life, a lot depends on luck, chance, or even fate. My life is mostly beyond my own control. Now, you can feel like that's the bureaucracy, it might be God, but it's really not you who ultimately decides what happens every day in your life. Versus B, I don't believe anybody or anything controls my life except me. If something bad happens, it's up to me to overcome it. Now, this is the real tests for these, by the way, are quite long, so I'm cheating by just giving you a little bit of brain candy here, but this is called locus of control. And if you're wired to be more of an external locus of control, you really feel whipsawed sometimes by the things that happen in the world. Despite your best efforts, you get derailed. Whereas the internal locus of control focused person is more like Steve Jobs. You kind of don't care about what others think or focus groups. You make things happen. Again, if you're trying to engage or persuade somebody and they're wired for external and you're giving them an internal proposition, you're going to have a clash. There are other measures, many of them that we test for. There's something called need for cognition, which you can be high or low on. Somebody in a very high need for cognition loves thinking about thinking. If you give them a study, they're going to really read the citations and footnotes, and they're going to try to double check on you. Meanwhile, somebody low in cognition, not so interested. Somebody high in need for affect or emotion really is much more moved by narratives, especially emotional narratives, and maybe visuals more than text or data. So we're wired differently to make sense of things. It's not a correlation with how smart you are so much as how you make sense of things. There are those also who do their best to avoid emotion, and those who really, like a moth to a flame, approach emotion. And again, you need to know that about individuals. And we can be either more intuitive or analytical, or more hedonic or utilitarian. And all of these make a big difference. There's something called the Zimbardo time perspective, and that refers to how you are wired to make sense of the world through a lens of time. Some people are much more influenced by how they grew up. So it's a lens of the past. And it can be a good nostalgic lens, or it can be a very bad upbringing. And you're still, influenced by that. Or those who are really rooted in the present, who may be very hedonic or fatalistic. And then there are those sometimes rare birds who are very much thinking about future consequences for actions today. So how you are wired on a time perspective also makes a big difference. Now, the third lens that we use for creating this sense-making genome is identity. And I'm going to show you just one of those aspects, and it comes out of Dan Kahan's work at Yale on cultural cognition at the Cultural Cognition Project. And it goes a long way to explaining why hashtag we're not all in this together. You may remember all the ads during the pandemic, hashtag we're all in this together, until we came ripping apart at the seams. What was that all about? Well, the cultural cognition framework works a little bit like this. Some of us are wired to be more hierarchical. If you look at the top, that means we're just more comfortable with every situation or context where there's a clear boss and a clear pecking order below it. So the military, for example, most corporations, unless you're, say, a startup, and could even be your book club. Who's in charge of this book club? What's the agenda? So those people are much more comfortable in a hierarchical construct, but their opposites at the bottom of the screen are egalitarians, and they feel, who made you the boss of me? You're not my boss. This is a consensus flat sort of preference for the world of decision making and social structure. If you look at the horizontal axis on the far left, you'll see individualists. And this is when people are wired to believe that all outcomes are on you. Responsibility, outcomes are on you. Don't blame the greater social safety net. Don't blame that you were born in poverty or a wrong zip code. They just believe everything's on you. Personal accountability, personal freedom, personal liberties. Meanwhile, their opposites on the other side, the communitarians, believe, if you're human, you should be part of the human family, which means you've got to concern most about those underprivileged, those most harmed by inequality. And so when you look at the confluence of these forces, I'm going to take you through two quadrants that explain things like what happened in America during things like mask mandates or vaccine mandates. If that upper left quadrant of hierarchical individualists are really about respecting their chosen authority, not necessarily any authority, their chosen authority, they're big believers in free markets as the best solutions. They believe that once government or NGOs get involved, they may have goodwill and a big heart, but they just mess it up. So they think that free markets are most effective and efficient. Strong believers in security, like national security, and they really want that nostalgia of traditions of how things used to be better in the past. Well, diagonally opposite on the bottom right, they don't see eye to eye with the communitarian egalitarians. Now, they think that markets cheat. Markets make the rich richer and the poor poorer. They exploit. So markets need to be regulated. They believe in redistribution of wealth if need be to make things fair, but certainly to correct the many, many inequalities in our society, which leads to a demand for social progress, not the status quo. And God help us, not nostalgia, they would say, when things were even worse. So again, knowing this, you can see this around you. For example, there is something behavioral scientists track, the Cracker Barrel Whole Foods divide, even for voting, and certainly for worldviews. And if you superimpose those on this graphic, it would look something like this. So again, knowing all this can lead to a kind of empathy where instead of converting you, and by the way, you're not going to convert people. So instead of converting you, how do I decode your sense-making genome and then engage you in a way by me changing to resonate with you? Well, that was all done so far, what I've shown you, through traditional research methods online or in person, where you actually have an individual answer a battery of tests. But what if you don't have that ability? How can you decode people remotely, say through inference? And this is taking off rapidly, for good and for bad. So there are 6 quick ways, and there will be more, that inference is taking place, and especially now with AI accelerating this for pattern recognition. One is eye tracking, another is text parsing, images, especially faces, music and audio, your mobile phone behavior, and social engagement. Now, these patents have been filed for inferring your personality by these companies, Facebook, Google, Spotify, Microsoft, and others. So they have great interest in looking at your digital footprint and digital breadcrumbs to figure out who you really are, not who you say you are necessarily. So quickly with eye tracking, it sounds pretty amazing, but they purport to have found correlations with personality just based on eye movement. And then with text, when you look back at the legend, Pennebaker, the behavioral science linguist who founded the company Receptivity with an I at the end, really terrific work. Pennebaker invented linguistic inquiry word count, or pronounced LIWC, pronounced Luke. And this is a very powerful tool for decoding humans through text mining and parsing. It's very sophisticated, looking at a number of combinations of words in different ratios. And there are others as well. But suffice it to say that they too claim to have been able to decode your personality through your language use. It might just be, haphazard posts, it might be tweets, or it might be a transcript of something you have said in an interview. Now, when it comes to images, it can get really fascinating and quite dodgy very quickly. So if you look at this, there's already work being done on decoding people merely by having a picture of their face. That's right, a picture of their face. But it's also being done by videos and video interviews and by audio. And this one was hugely controversial. Somebody well known in this area, Mikhail Kaczynski, who's now at Stanford, formerly at Cambridge, did this work, and he does it, mind you, as a white hat hacker. He did this work that purports to show that you can decode and predict sexual orientation merely by somebody's face. Now, he, in his research, warns you, this is not a good thing. This is something that should be regulated and probably should not be done. But he does it to show you that it is possible. In music and in audio, Spotify is an incredibly rich database, and most people don't lie. They don't do impression management with their own playlists. They tend to choose what they really like. And then changes within the playlist habits can be a tell as well. But Spotify has gone on to try to correlate aspects of that personality that I showed you, the 5 factors, with genres of music. Now, phone behavior predictions come through not just, do you use a phone or not, but what apps, in what context, what geographies, what time of day, what networks. Social media is filled with too many of me to walk you through, but they even go by platform. So predicting personality by Twitter or by Instagram, etc. Now, all of that is to decode you. But what if I want to use AI to imbue, say, a chatbot with a personality that does not clash with your personality, for example? This is a new realm of artificial empathy, and it's going into recommendation engines. It's going into user experience and user design. It's going into chatbots in 2 ways, using a chatbot to glean clues about your personality, but also to morph to become the personality you want it to be. Now, at its best, all of this can be used as a kind of programmatic empathy. And I use this at large scale, and with one example here of decoding people for their vaccine concerns. And by the way, this is not about educating people into it or more information. They have very logical reasons why they are concerned, and they're very different. We've tested for more than 30 forms of vaccine concerns, but we also decoded with their permission these same individuals and then ran a series of narratives, each narrative a Trojan horse for a different cognitive bias or heuristic. And it creates a kind of 3D heat map where ultimately you can map the concern with the person and how they're wired with the storyline or narrative that works best for them. And that's where you see the darker squares in the heat map. However, while this can lead you to some really interesting, wonderful empathy, and I wrote about this in Harvard Business Review, that you could use ChatGPT or Bard to run simulated conversations before you actually have them. So imagine you're a physician and you're frustrated because you're not doing a great or a very effective job at getting a patient to understand why perhaps they should take this medication or get this vaccination. You can prompt the AI with the personality traits and cognitive styles of this theoretical patient and a goal, and then run a simulated dialogue. And I gave specific prompts, whether it's related to climate change or vaccines or other issues. You can check that out. A caution, a huge caution. ChatGPT and Bard in my tests, when you ask it to cite references, it will very quickly, and you say, my God, it saved me hundreds of hours of citing everything. They're all fabricated. I have found them to be all fabricated. So do not use the citations and references when you challenge AI for how do you know these things. Now, finally, a caution, because all of these tools, because they're not regulated yet, could be used in a kind of malicious manipulation. Instead of empathy, it may be mal-empathological. It could be something really horrible. And as we go through this next phase of social media meets behavioral science, meets artificial intelligence, you're bound to run into some very, very frustrating experiences such as this one.
We are canceling the show.
What?
Why? Well, the algorithm felt it wasn't hitting the right taste clusters.
Taste clusters. It's been 12 hours. Don't we need time to get word of mouth?
Oh, the algorithm takes word of mouth into account, but it considers other things too. For instance, if viewers see someone eating dessert within the first 2 minutes of the episode, they almost always finish the entire season.
Always.
Oh, and it's not just dessert. The same goes for Central Park, Kittens, Dev Patel.
We have a 98 on Rotten Tomatoes.
Right.
98. And people were crying at the screening.
I know, and I was one of them, but I guess I was wrong. Yeah, you know, I've been doing this for 30 years, and if there's anything I've learned, it's nobody knows anything except the algorithm.
Fuck the algorithm!
And with that, Sinan, I hand it back to you, but you can see these tools are both amazing, maybe leading us to a kind of rapprochement and resonance on the one hand, but a very malicious manipulation possibility on the other. And I'm going to stop sharing right there.
Chris, thank you. That was enlightening, frightening, and as well, potentially very useful in a lot of ways. So I wanted to ask, you know, just straight off the bat, some in the audience may be thinking to themselves upon hearing this, haven't we heard this sort of tune before? Wasn't it Cambridge Analytica that was supposed to have decoded us and been able to make us vote the way that they wanted us to? And wasn't it, you know, other manipulative sources before that? Is there something different today? And if so, what is it?
Yeah, so Cambridge Analytica, and I happen to have interviewed their former CEO Alexander Nix in front of a fairly large audience 6 weeks before the election of 2016. And he described what they did as a kind of marketing micro segmentation of personality for his words, and it's actually on YouTube, his words, fear-based marketing. So I would say that goes toward my caution there at the end. Now, they were also accused of some overreaching claims. Here's what they had done with Facebook. Before they changed their terms of service, had this My Personality quiz. And as people would take the quiz and just click, yeah, as we do on these permissions, embedded and hidden back in those permissions was that they had the ability to scrape all of your friends as well and all of their likes. And so they very quickly pulled together millions and millions of potential personality decodings to do. And they did it by likes more than anything. And again, Mikhail Kaczynski, who I cited there with the faces and sexual orientation, had done an early piece of work on correlations, predictive correlations between your Facebook likes and various aspects of your personality. Now, in retrospect, compared to what we can do today, it was kind of crude. And yes, I think Cambridge Analytica, did it for marketing to sell their consulting political services, perhaps more than accuracy. However, there was a kernel of truth to what they were after. And you can see in an arms race for this, how what they have made overreaching claims about could actually come to be true. But I hasten to give the caution that it's not about changing somebody. I doubt you could have taken a dyed-in-the-wool Trump MAGA supporter and converted them to Hillary. It's more likely an activation. In other words, to piss you off enough or scare you enough to actually vote, as opposed to convert you. My caution to people when I see this and study this is I'm not in the conversion therapy business. I'm in the getting to know you better business. And if it's honest and if it's ethical, you know that I'm testing you. You've agreed to be tested. And I will never come back to target you as an individual. And then in aggregate for lookalikes, even for marketers, they need to abide by certain ethical codes on this. And the people whose personalities are being inferred need to believe truthfully that the person doing this is doing it in their own best interest.
What are sort of the regulatory constraints and or guidelines with regard to using these technologies? Are there any, or is it?
I think like with everything that'll start in Europe, like GDPR did, no doubt it will start in Europe. The US may never regulate it. I will never forget when Zuckerberg was pulled in front of Congress for hearings some years ago, and Saturday Night Live did a skit parodying it, and they had an elderly senator say, "Mr. Zuckerberg, my VCR is flashing 1200. Did you do that?" I think honestly, our regulators are so far behind the technology that they risk either way. They risk not regulating it properly, or they risk over-regulating it to squash innovation, as in many areas. So it is an area of self-regulation should be first, but I don't believe that will be sufficient. With most commerce under the pressure of losing business or making huge amounts of money, self-regulation seems to fall to the wayside. But at least that's a start where you could have industries agree to hold hands on certain codes on this.
And are you aware, for example, of any of the extent to which the patents and or the technology, the patents you showed or the technologies you described are actually being used? So when you say Spotify is inferring your personality or Facebook is that happening?
If it is, they're not talking about that publicly as an offering or as a form of intelligence right now. I think many post-Cambridge Analytica got pretty scared about, what. I'll never forget seeing a YouTube of Adobe introducing a new product called Voco, which if you'll see, it didn't come out, but it was basically text to speech. And now you would have seen on 60 Minutes this past week an example of that, of duping somebody with text to speech. of if I capture enough of your natural language, say in a video, then I have it. And if I use a text-to-speech AI, I can type anything, and in your voice and cadence, it will say it. So I could dupe other people that it's you. And in the case of 60 Minutes, dupe this correspondence assistant to giving their passport information. Voco was that. And they showed it with great joy and laughter in the audience and a few gasps that they could just type in text and have you, without your knowledge, say anything. I think quickly people realized, that may not be something we should put out there as a triumphal sort of victory quite yet.
So let me get you to sketch two scenarios. The first is the beneficial scenario, and the second is the malign scenario. So in its best case, what can this kind of approach be used for in a positive way to sort of further humanity? And in a worst case, what is your diabolical, what can your diabolical mind come up with that might be harmful for us? Yeah, exactly.
Yes. So in the best case, I think of health. People who actually want help. So maybe they, want to, for their own health, need to maintain or lose weight. They need to get more exercise. They need to quit smoking. They need to stay on their meds, and they're having trouble staying on their meds. There are a myriad of health-related things that people could opt into and say, I actually want help with this. I don't want you to creep me out. I want you to help me. And by doing this, I've done this looking at things like anxiety, depression, obesity, smoking cessation, substance abuse. If you know how somebody's wired and respectfully approach them on their terms in ways that make sense to them, you probably have a slightly better shot at helping them rather than lecturing them or shaming them or humiliating. Same goes for vaccine concerns, I would say. So many, many things in the health arena. Second, in a kind of polarization of society, when you understand that maybe somebody is maybe not an idiot and maybe not, really a terrible person, but they're profoundly wired to view the world and how it should work in a very different way from the way you do. And if you accept you're not going to change them, then in a more programmatic way, how might you meet each other, understanding you have incompatible wiring? And that's a long shot, but possible. Third, in disinformation, and this one will cut both ways. In disinformation, or actually protecting young people from getting recruited into extremist groups, understanding how they're wired and what makes them vulnerable to malicious recruitment might lend some effectiveness to heading that off, or an off-ramp before they get into real serious trouble. Now, on the other way around, if I'm looking for the perfect disinformation, I'm going to decode you, and then I'm going to run permutations. And unlike my article in HBR, which was about physicians helping patients, imagine I'm trying to whip you up into anger, into further polarization. I will have better tools and a much more finely nuanced understanding of your hot buttons.
So can you give me some sort of sense of what the future of this looks like? In other words, if you're looking out 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, what is the likely sort of next version, next level, and the extent to which this is going to be implemented or not implemented based on conversations that you're having?
Yeah, first I would go back to a kind of Gartner hype curve on this, because we're seeing lots of interest and it's very nascent and taking off. And there's bound to be a trough of disillusionment in here where people say, hang on, it's bunk, or it doesn't work as well as they claim. There will be many on the commercial side making overreaching, over claiming what it can do as a kind of magic. It is not magic. It's still science, which means you're going to find some things stumble and don't reproduce, and you should be honest about that. So I think as we go forward, we're going to see a hype about the ability to do this, which is both filled with fear and with dread. And then I think we'll go down into a sort of considered, well, some of that was really bullshit. And maybe we ought to rethink this whole thing. And emerging from that, a more considered, reflective approach to programmatic empathy. I think, though, the weaponization of it is unpredictable, because I imagine if I'm with an extremist group and I'm thinking of a very vulnerable, disenfranchised, depressed 16-year-old somewhere, this may give me a myriad of ways of luring them in. And so that means a kind of arms race. There will be those on the good side and the bad side as the tools get better and better. And I have no idea how that will end.
So that brings us to our first audience question, which is exactly on that point. An audience member asks, the primary concern is how younger people can be influenced by this, not necessarily just a decoding of them, but a recording of them, and I might add an influencing of them. Can you talk for a minute about the influencing or the decoding specifically of young people who may not be as skeptical and may also be more directly sort of having this element as part of the way they interact with society and the world? Can you talk about that for a second?
Yeah, I think we'll come back to identity on this. I think when none of us is as rational as we claim to be when we think about making any of these decisions, and more your links to a tribe or various tribes, your implicit identity is the cultural glue and the motivator for you for meaning and belonging. So if you think of a young person who has yet to have perhaps the experience and self-confidence of fending off these insecurities, then identity is going to be weaponized. So in other words, how I get to you is by impersonating somebody you greatly admire or wished you could hang with or wished you could be. And creating that ideal self becomes a kind of evil Trojan horse. And so I think you'll look for it. This is where the notion of spoofing voice and spoofing videos, people are thinking about it technically, where they're thinking about, well, I'll watermark it or what have you. No, it's much fuzzier, I think, than that. It's identity. And I think if, there's something called convert communicators taught to me by the great Eric Johnson, who is a behavioral scientist. And it's often used in, people like Rene DiResta would know this, that it's used with formers. In other words, those who were recruited into extremist groups and got disillusioned and left, and they become kind of a good testimonial as a former, as a convert communicator. Convert communicators work well in health as well. So, but imagine a convert communicator for evil. So now I've penetrated your sort of Jack Teixeira tribe on Discord, and I'm part of the gaming group that sees the world, you see it, and I can really whip you up into action.
So thanks for mentioning Rene. Rene DiResta is going to be spotlighted later in the program. She's moderating and participating in a panel near the end of the day. But what you just described about whipping people into a frenzy is the subject of our next audience question, which I think gets to a lot of the fears that people have when they hear about this type of technology, which is to say, the audience member asks, Hitler embraced cutting-edge radio and moving picture technology to create a populist movement that became a fascist dictatorship. Is it inevitable that someone does the same with this? Can populists move faster than democratic institutions?
Yes. Populism catches fire very, very rapidly. Particularly, there are aspects. What I found in the those who were more swayed by, say, misinformation or disinformation, and we all distinguish between the two. Misinformation is not malicious; it's sloppy. You really are propagating something that's not true, but you don't mean ill will necessarily about it. Whereas disinformation is intentional. And if I looked at those, and if you begin to see, and this is where Gordon Pennycook does terrific behavioral science work on is there a certain wiring that makes some of us more vulnerable to this than others? I think that when you think about whipping people into a frenzy with populism, part of it is this notion of I am not stupid, I did the research myself. And so part of it is the ingenuity of of like QAnon making people feel that it didn't actually feed them these conspiracies. It created clues that only the really clever could put together. And so there's an aspect of this where if you do that, yeah, it can catch fire really, really rapidly. And people are super convinced and really hard to move because they believe that anything you're using to pre-bunk or debunk is part of the conspiracy. So there's this kind of race, and pre-bunking is an area that I hope they talk more about later in the program today, that is being tested over and over again. Pre-bunking, if you've not heard of it in the audience, it is, I am going to inoculate you basically by saying, hey, this is what they're going to say, and this is why they think it's going to work. And when you hear it, now you know the truth. And so by sort of desensitizing people to conspiracies by pre-bunking, there's some hope that that works. It's still being tested. But yes, I would agree that it does catch fire much more rapidly than democratic institutions. And it's coupled, I'm afraid, with a lack of critical thinking, a lack of a respect for empiricism and scientific method today, and media literacy. And that's not an overnight fix. I think you would have to start with pre-K and not indoctrinating, the opposite. People fear indoctrination when you talk about empiricism and scientific method. No, it's about letting them become informed skeptics, so that they challenge things, as I challenged ChatGPT when it gave me this brilliant list of citations that were fabricated. So that is an intergenerational fix. I would say 40 years, if we have that much time. We may not, but 40 years, when you think about the education of 2 generations in the curricula that bring back civic, scientific method, critical thinking, and media literacy. Once a kid is 12 or 13 and indoctrinated into a tribe, I think it's probably too late unless they've kind of had some sort of epiphany along the way.
So let me bring that into a related conversation, which is to say that, which is to ask you about the role of expertise, the role of experts, and the role of reputation in all of this. So as a sort of preamble to that question, you may or may not know that we published a study recently in Nature Human Behavior about the role of identity cues in social media. In other words, blue check marks or other types of cues that indicate the expertise or the validity of verification of the identity of someone or their name and their prior reputation. Our work, which randomized on a very large social media platform whether those cues were available or not, showed that between 30 and 60% of the variation in people's opinions and behaviors could be explained by these cues, and that when we have these cues, we are much more likely to be in system 1 than in system 2 thinking. So we have knee-jerk reactions to these cues. They provide the footholds on which we engage in-group, out-group dynamics. Are they part of my in-group or part of my out-group, and so on? And so based on what you're saying, the belief in conspiracies, the idea that ChatGPT can give you a bunch of fake citations, the idea that ChatGPT can give you a bunch of false answers to questions, and it's difficult to discern unless you do your own work whether it's true or false. The question is, what is the role of experts and expertise in maintaining a sense of truth and vigilance and rigor in human society? And if they play a role, then what is the trajectory of technology going to do to their role?
This is a really profound question, and I've seen conflicting findings, in fact, on this. For those of you who have not seen the book by, I think it's Tom Nichols, The Death of Expertise, it really addresses this. And when you look at confirmation bias meets tribal identity, we see this again. There was a study done by Dan Kahan out of Yale testing a fictional scientist or scientists and gave you their face, their name, their degrees, their awards, and the titles of the papers that they had published. And people had a tough time determining whether they were an expert or not, until they had a thread of evidence as to whether that expert agreed with them. And when that expert agreed with them, they were seen as, yes, that's an expert. And if they showed kind of cues that the expert was in the opposite side of an issue, say climate change, then they dismissed them as an idiot, even though they have exactly the same degrees and expertise. So this confirmation bias really is a powerful distortion filter when it comes to determining who or what is an expert source. I have seen the different studies by Kahan versus Sander van der Linden on the system 1 versus system 2. And just a quick reminder for people, system 1 from Dan Kahneman, the Nobel laureate, system 1 is about 90 to 95% of the time humans make decisions on a very fast, instinctual blink, very low energy, very habit sort of approach, and about only 5 or 10% of the time a very effortful, intentional, conscious sort of decision making. System 1 tends to be littered with inaccuracies compared to system 2. However, it made a lot of sense evolution because we have put speed over being right. It's better to be wrong and fast and still alive than be correct and dead. So speed for our species was very, very powerful and important. So if you look at, will an expert brand convey a sense of credibility or accuracy? And I would append to that, for whom? Because there are those who will look at that and say, yes, I digest New England Journal of Medicine, or I like that brand or that brand of journalism, and I can trust them. Things like NewsGuard by my former colleague, Gordon Krovitz at the Wall Street Journal. NewsGuard gives a green, yellow, or red light to a news source, not a story, but a source. And I would put forward that only works for those who care. That if it doesn't fit your narrative, you're going to throw them out as being in the tank for the enemy, which is why the Pinocchios and the Pants on Fire ratings don't work if you are hell-bent to be part of that tribe, because you don't want anything that's going to conflict with your identity, which is your membership in that tribe. So I think experts have become mutable and dynamic and are only deemed experts for some, particularly if they feel comfortable that that expert is aligned with them, which leads me to my biggest fear, which is, how do you have a system that is based on rule of law, which is in turn based on evidence and adjudication of the evidence, if we cannot agree on two things: what constitutes evidence and whether the judge is an independent critical thinker or in the tank for somebody else?
Well, I mean, that is a profound thought just there. I think that could be the subject of an entire panel and an entire conversation. I think it would be well worth it, and probably too short if we took an hour to talk about that last thought. I want to sort of think a little bit about countermeasures. An audience member asks, could these personality modelers be actively and defensively employed by users as a sort of detection and warning system for quote unquote button pushing that's tuned to users' personalities?
Yeah, and that's a very clever question too, because imagine now I understand all this and all the different ways somebody might be probing me for little implicit tells or cues. It's kind of like you're playing a huge game of poker and they're trying to figure out, are you bluffing or not? And, are you scared? Do you have it? And in this sense, what kind of questions might elicit a response that would be a tell for them? So you could create a form of self-protective intelligence that would maybe screen and alert you to people probing you for identity related clues, right? So imagine now I have something that works in the background that says, before you answer that question, you should know this, that the way you answer it could identify your level of fear, anxiety, neuroticism, or could identify your level of introversion or extroversion. And so you could imagine, and I'm sure nobody's begun to work on this, so a clever idea for you, that you could create a self-defense to this, that as people are trying to probe you with seemingly oblique or tangential questions, but are really raising answers that will give them clues, maybe you've got a kind of, force field up here saying, before you answer that, Sinan, you should know how the answer might be used.
All right, we got 2 minutes. I'm gonna ask you to give your thoughts and opinions on a theory that I've had recently and see if I can't get a little bit of feedback myself, which is to say that in looking at these technologies, and every time we've had this kind of revolution in the human landscape, we experience what's known as skill bias technical change. So in other words, the technology complements some human skills and substitutes for other human skills, and you see changes in the labor market that are automating out jobs that the technology substitutes for and improving the marginal productivity of jobs that the technology complements. And the trillion or multiple $1 trillion question at this point is, what are the skills that are being complemented and substituted in this moment of generative AI and the rise of AI, and some debate whether we're moving towards artificial general intelligence or not, and so on. And so my theory is that we had an era since the Industrial Revolution of specialization, where people benefited in their careers and in their jobs and in the labor market for becoming deeply specialized in a given thing into which they were experts. They're doctors, they're lawyers, these are high-paying jobs. And that AI is very good at being narrow, that it can do one thing that it's trained to do very well, and that the future human endeavors that will be more difficult to automate away will be the jobs and that involve a constellation or a cluster of skills together, that it's hard to get a single machine to do all of those things well. And that the generalist, in a sense, will be privileged in the economy of the future as a result of this. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yes, 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 but, and this is what I mean, there is a brilliant writer, blogger named Maria Popova, who for many years has run it used to be called Brain Pickings, now called The Marginalian. And she makes a really profound point about combinatorial creativity, which is what you're talking about. That is that seemingly unique human skill, and not all humans have it, of combining things that nobody else has combined. That so much invention and innovation is about reconnecting dots that are under everybody's nose, but we don't see them and you do. And you have that little leap of imagination that allows you to do that. I believe that that's the power, in fact, in liberal arts education as an analogy, because a great liberal arts education creates a kind of agility to be able to combine and recombine disparate fields of study rather than going deeper and deeper down one field that may become obsolete. However, how long until AI doesn't also create a kind of serendipity engine, a kind of combinatorial creativity engine? So I would say for now, that human notion of not going deeper and narrower, but to what you described as a network or cluster or combinatorial creativity, this ability to combine and recombine in unthought ways, is uniquely human and huge. How long before that is actually trainable for AI?
So, and again, we are 1 minute over, so I'm going to give you 30 seconds to answer this question that Elon Musk got asked recently in an interview, which is, given that paints a very bleak picture for the future employment prospects of any human being. So what advice would you give to your kids, grandkids, and future generations for how they should approach the job market going forward and their skills development going forward?
Yeah, one of my daughters actually is a software engineer for a company that uses AI for legal services and financial services. So she's already kind of in there. The other is in research, and she is now going to get a graduate degree in data visualization. And I think there for both of them, my counsel has been, and to their great suffering, like chatting with them every day about understanding AI as a tool and as an assistant, as a best case scenario, that if you are somebody who deeply understands how to leverage AI as a tool, at least in the hierarchy of humans as they get laid off, you may be last. So you're the one who understands the tool the best.
Chris Graves, thank you so much for being here. The thought was provoking, the speech was provoking, and the conversation was fantastic. It's always great to have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.